Seeing her friend touch her husband's leg under the table at the anniversary celebration, the wife suspected something was off and deciding to play along. The Howard family's home was filled with the aroma of jasmine and fresh baking. Maria, in an exquisite champagne-colored dress, nervously adjusted her unruly curls. Today was her and Greg's anniversary, their 5th wedding anniversary, and she had dreamed of making this day special, filled with love and joy. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Maria, her heart racing, rushed to open it. Standing on the doorstep was Natalie, her best friend, with a dazzling smile and a bouquet of scarlet roses. "Maria, happy anniversary," exclaimed the guest, embracing her friend. "You look so beautiful." "That's how it should be. A wedding anniversary doesn't happen every day." "Thank you, Natalie, for coming." Maria, unable to hide her joy, led her into the living room, where a table was already set with candles and balloons decorating the space. "Greg, hey!" Without giving Maria a chance to respond, Natalie turned her attention to her husband. "I'm so happy to see you, Greg. If it weren't for the celebration, we probably wouldn't have met." Greg, tall and handsome with kind eyes, smiled in return. "I'm happy to see you too, Natalie," he said, gallantly extending his hand. And in that moment, as if in slow motion, Natalie, ignoring Maria, pulled Greg toward her and kissed him. On the cheek, of course. At first glance, nothing serious. But the kiss from the friends seemed unusually long, passionate, as if they hadn't seen each other in an eternity. Maria froze in surprise. Her smile became frozen on her face. "Oh, sorry," Natalie said, embarrassed, pulling away from Greg. "I was just so happy to see both of you, emotions got the best of me." Greg, also slightly taken aback, mumbled, "It's fine, we're happy to see you too." After that, taking Natalie by the hand, he led her to the table, ignoring his stunned wife. "Maria, darling, I want to congratulate you and Greg on this wonderful occasion," said Natalie, handing them an elegant box with expensive watches and a bouquet of flowers. "I'm so happy that you found each other. You have such a beautiful relationship, you are the perfect couple. As they say, husband and wife are one." "Oh, never mind, I won't finish that sentence." Maria, trying to control her emotions, managed to force out a tight smile. The celebration had started off rather poorly. "Thank you, Natalie," she replied, trying not to look her friend in the eye. At the table, with the soft light of the candles, the conversation drifted to trivial matters, but Maria couldn't focus on the words. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Natalie, sitting next to Greg, playfully touching his hand under the table. Sometimes, at the most unexpected moments, Natalie would step on Greg's foot with her sharp heel, and Greg seemed not to notice her attempts to grab his attention. Thoughts swirled in Maria's head like a whirlwind. What's going on? Have I been living in an illusion of happiness all this time? And Greg, how could he? Especially on a day like this. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clenched her lips, trying not to let them escape. "Maria, you've been quiet the whole time," Natalie asked, noticing that her friend had suddenly turned pale. "You don't look so well. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Maria whispered, trying to sound confident, just a little tired. "After all, we don't celebrate our 5th wedding anniversary every day." She took a sip of champagne and decided to play along with their lie. Maria wasn't looking for a scandal. She didn't want to ruin the celebration, but she knew, first and foremost, she had to get to the bottom of this situation, and only then draw conclusions. "Well, let's have some fun, then," Natalie winked at her and, turning to Greg, subtly placed her hand on his knee. Maria tried to hold herself together, but her heart was breaking with pain. She didn't know how to react, because she understood that Natalie and Greg were clearly hiding something very important that could destroy her life. "Greg, I think you forgot to tell me about the new addition to your watch collection," Maria said, trying to join the conversation and take control of the situation. She tried to speak naturally, but her voice betrayed her nervousness completely. Ah, yes, exactly. Her husband diverted his attention from Natalie but quickly returned to the previous topic. And can you imagine, it's so beautiful, I didn't even. Maria, don't you want to dance? Her friend asked, not letting Greg finish. Let's play some music, dance, and remember our student days. Like that time, remember? When I broke my heel at the disco, and you suggested I take off the other one to match. Oh, right. Let's dance, Greg exclaimed, not letting his wife answer, and was the first to get up from the table. Maria silently followed his example. She tried not to notice how Natalie's hand was once again resting on her husband's shoulder. The music started. A light, cheerful tune. Maria felt her husband's hand wrap around her waist, but she felt cold. She tried not to look him in the eyes, not wanting to reveal her pain. Maria, you seem different today. It's a celebration, and you're upset? Greg whispered, pulling her closer. Did something happen? Everything's fine, she answered in a flat voice. No, it's not fine, her husband insisted. You're my wife, but you're acting like a stranger. Greg, please, not now. Maria whispered. The last thing she wanted was to talk about it in front of her friend, especially since her head was spinning oddly, and she had only taken a couple of sips of champagne. Struggling to shake off the dizziness, she stepped away from Greg and made her way to the table. Her husband watched her go, and then his gaze met Natalie's. So, Greg, shall we dance? She asked. Of course. Maria watched them dance. Her heart was breaking with pain. Her best friend and her husband. God, what is happening? Have some champagne and come join us. Natalie smiled, filling Maria's glass with sparkling wine. It really lifts your mood. Maria, uncertain, took the drink and swirled the glass in her hands. Maybe it's just her imagination. Maybe she was overreacting and mistaking her fears for reality. Greg looked so handsome, how could she not feel jealous? And Maria really didn't want to ruin the evening. She slowly brought the glass to her lips. Uncertainty and fear flashed in her eyes. What are you afraid of? She asked herself mentally, feeling the warmth of her hands absorb the cold crystal of the glass. But it was her husband and best friend. Could they really hurt her? Maria closed her eyes and took a big sip. Immediately, a pleasant, slightly sweet, bubbling taste spread in her mouth. But beneath the sweetness, there was something unclear, unfamiliar. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced Maria's head. It became difficult to breathe, and her body weakened helplessly. Her gaze involuntarily stopped on the clock face of the wall clock. It was only 8 in the evening, and yet it felt like she should already be asleep. Greg, she tried to call for her husband's help, but for some reason, her voice turned into a whisper. Maria, what happened? Her husband exclaimed. Natalie. Maria barely whispered her friend's name. She. What about her? Greg leaned closer to his wife, showing concern in his every movement. But Maria didn't have time to finish. Her body began to weaken, and within a minute, she lost consciousness. Darling. Greg shouted, embracing her shoulders. What's wrong with you? Natalie quickly approached them. What happened? She asked. She just lost consciousness, Greg replied, panicking as he started shaking Maria. We need to call an ambulance, fast. Oh, come on, don't panic. I think it's just from exhaustion. The anniversary and all the festivities can be so tiring, Natalie said with a strange smile. Yeah, maybe, Greg agreed, reaching for the phone lying on the edge of the table. Natalie smirked and shook her head. After a while, the sound of an engine could be heard, the approaching car. Must be the ambulance, Greg thought and went to open the door. The light in the hospital room was blinding, making it impossible for the patient to focus on anything specific. Maria tried to sit up, but weakness bound her body like a spider's web. Her head throbbed, and her mouth was so dry it felt like she had crossed the Sahara Desert alone. Water. she whispered in a hoarse, barely audible voice. From somewhere in the distance, muffled voices of the staff, hurried footsteps, and the clattering of medical trolley wheels could be heard. Maria tried to make out her surroundings, but everything swam before her eyes. White walls, bright light, strange devices connected to her arm. Where was she? What happened? The last thing she remembered was the champagne glass, the bitter aftertaste in her mouth, and darkness. No, wait, the wall clock. It showed the time, 8 o'clock. But why did she need all these details? Suddenly, a figure appeared in her field of vision. A woman in a white coat, with a kind, slightly tired face, approached the bed. "You're awake?" she asked, smiling. "How are you feeling?" "What's wrong with me?" Maria tried to sit up, but pain shot through her head, and she fell back onto the pillow weakly. "You're in the hospital. This is the intensive care unit," the nurse replied, checking the pulse at her wrist. "You lost consciousness at the celebration. You've been poisoned." Poisoned? Maria frowned, trying to remember what she had eaten and drunk. "Well, I didn't feel anything." "It was probably something like a sleeping pill," said Wanda. "We took a blood sample, and the results will be ready soon." "I wonder how this could have happened." Maria felt her heart tighten with fear and suspicion. "You can tell the doctor everything later," Wanda smiled reassuringly. "Right now, the most important thing is rest. I'll bring you some water." Wanda left, and Maria was left alone, struggling with the rising panic. Greg, Natalie. Her thoughts swirled in her head like leaves in an autumn whirlwind. The room became unnaturally quiet. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. Her memory was definitely failing her. She could only see fragments. The celebration, Greg, Natalie, a strange feeling of awkwardness, and her bad mood, that bitter taste. So much for the anniversary. Footsteps were heard again in the hallway, and a young doctor entered the room. Tall, with dark hair and a warm, welcoming smile. "Hello, Maria," he said, approaching her. "My name is Brett, and I'm your attending physician." "Hello," Maria whispered, hoping the doctor would shed some light on this dreadful mystery. "I hope Wanda has already told you what happened?" Brett asked, adjusting his coat. "Yes. She said I was poisoned." "Well, I won't hide anything from you." "That is indeed the case," the doctor confirmed. "We've already taken a blood sample for analysis, but personally and informally, I suspect it's a medication overdose. Something like a sleeping pill or sedative. The dose wasn't dangerous, but the issue lies elsewhere. Your body has developed a strong allergic reaction to this substance." "Sleeping pills?" Maria repeated, confused. "But I didn't take any that day. And actually, I've been sleeping well lately. I've been tired, though. After my father's death, the whole business has been on me." "Ah, I understand." "I believe you, but it's too early to draw conclusions," Brett replied. "We're waiting for the test results. But, considering the circumstances, we'll consider various possibilities." Maria felt an icy chill run through her body. Where did everything go wrong? And in that moment, a doubt began to grow in her heart, like poisonous ivy, wrapping itself around her soul. "What are your next steps?" she asked cautiously. "We'll monitor your condition," the doctor answered. "As soon as the test results are in, we'll be able to determine the next steps in treatment." "Can I see my family?" "Of course. But it would be better if they come after you've had some rest. You need to recover." Maria nodded, looking at the doctor with hope. She really wanted to understand what had happened. She wanted to know who wished her harm. Brett left, and Maria was left alone with her thoughts and the relentless fear. The next few minutes passed in agonizing uncertainty. She listened to the noise in the hallway, the voices of doctors and nurses, and tried to calm her nerves. She felt like a ship caught in a storm, tossed by waves of doubt and fear. A nurse entered the room, carrying a glass of water. "How are you feeling?" she asked again. Fine, Maria replied, but I'm really thirsty. I'll help you with that now. And if you need more, I'll bring it, Wanda said. And don't think about the bad stuff. Everything will be fine. Easier said than done, Maria muttered. I still don't understand what happened to me. I was on my feet all day. I barely left the kitchen, getting ready for the celebration. Well, everything will gradually become clearer, Wanda reassured her. The doctors are doing everything they can to help you. And my husband, Maria hesitated. Does he know I'm here? Not yet, the nurse replied. The attending doctor asked that no one know about your condition for now. Oh, really? Maria whispered, feeling a sharp need to know the truth. I want everything to be different. I understand, Wanda said. But please, don't worry. Everything will get better, truly. Wanda left, and Maria was left alone with her thoughts and questions. Soon, Brett entered the room, holding papers with the results. Maria, he began, sitting on the table next to the bed. The tests confirm my suspicion. You really did suffer from a medication overdose. Overdose? What exactly was it? Maria asked, holding her breath. Traces of a powerful sleeping pill were found in your system. It's likely that it was mixed into your drink, or you consumed it with food, which is pretty unlikely. I was hoping it wasn't that. You know, for some reason, the strange aftertaste of the champagne really stuck with me. Yes, that's possible. It was a fairly safe substance, but your allergy. If we hadn't helped you in time, the consequences could have been unpredictable. And who could have done this? Maria asked. That's what we need to figure out, the doctor replied. You know, I'm starting to lean more towards involving the police. Maria visibly became upset. Excuse me, but could we avoid that? I wouldn't want the press to get hold of this, and honestly, I can't afford to be involved in any scandals right now. I have important negotiations coming up. I understand, Brett said. But this seems like a crime, and we're obligated to report such cases. I think you just need some time to think things through, but right now, your health is the most important thing. Well, all right, I won't report it for now, but we'll see later. When will I be discharged? Maria asked hopefully. It depends on your condition. You were brought in at 9:15 yesterday, so what do you expect? Not even a full day has passed. As you can understand, it's a short time, the doctor replied. But I think in a few days, you can go home. Thank you for everything. Brett smiled and left the room. At that moment, an anxious thought struck Maria. The doctor had said she was brought in at 9:15. But she clearly remembered that the clock had shown 8 o'clock. So what does that mean? Did the ambulance take over an hour to get to their house, or? No, that can't be right, she whispered to herself. On the other hand, facts are stubborn things, you can't argue with them. There were two possible explanations. Either the ambulance arrived an hour late, or Greg and Natalie called for help later. But then what had Greg and Natalie been doing all that time? The realization of the bitter truth hit her hard. Could her husband have betrayed her? And her best friend? They had been friends since university. They were like sisters, and now this. No, I shouldn't jump to conclusions. When Greg comes, we'll talk. I could come up with all sorts of things now, my head will spin, Maria decided, and wearily closed her eyes. She never liked accusing people without reason. It was no surprise her father had been a lawyer in his youth, used to following the law and its legal subtleties. Memory is a treacherous thing. It's like a river. Sometimes it's turbulent and fast, sometimes calm and quiet. And as Maria floated down this river, she unknowingly drifted into memories. Childhood, such a beautiful time. Sunlight filtering through the branches of the old apple tree in her grandmother's garden. The smell of freshly mowed grass mixed with the aroma of a cherry jam pie her mother, Sandra, baked. Maria, darling, come to lunch. "I'm coming, Mom," she replied with a smile. Maria remembered how her mother, a literature teacher at school, would read fairy tales to her at night, teach her to write the first letters, explain the meanings of beautiful words and expressions. And her father, James, a lawyer with a brilliant career, would take her fishing to her grandfather's house on weekends and also taught her to ride a bicycle. "Maria, you are a smart and beautiful girl," her father would say, tossing her in the air. "Dad, can we go on the carousel again?" she'd ask, laughing. "Of course, anything for you, even a star from the sky." At school, Maria was a good student. As a favorite of the teachers, she was passionate about literature, wrote poetry, and dreamed of becoming a journalist. She was the life of the party, always the center of attention, surrounded by friends who valued her for her kindness, sincerity, and sense of humor. "Maria, tell me, how did that day go?" her deskmate, Helen, would ask, listening with interest to her stories. "Oh, the usual," Maria would answer evasively, out of habit. "Lessons, homework, and of course, more stories about Grandma's village." "What about your poetry?" Helen would ask. I'm writing, Maria would smile. "I hope I'll publish it someday." At university, she studied journalism, wrote articles for the student newspaper, and participated in contests and festivals. "Maria, you're just a talent," said the professor, reading her latest article. "Thank you," the girl replied, blushing with pleasure. While her university friend Natalie barely passed her exams, almost failing the most important one, journalism clearly wasn't her strong suit. It was hard to guess why she even chose this department, but it certainly wasn't to become Maria's friend, the beloved and popular star of the entire class. However, Maria didn't think about this at the time. It was during university, at one of the student parties, that she met Greg. Her future husband turned out to be older than her. He studied economics, was charming, smart, and charismatic. "Hi, I'm Greg," he said, extending his hand. "Would you mind dancing?" "I'm Maria," she replied, feeling her cheeks flush. "I don't mind, but I won't be comfortable dancing fast in heels." "Don't worry, we'll wait for a slow song," the guy smiled, understanding her concern. Their relationship developed quickly. They spent a lot of time together, walking in parks, going to the movies and theaters, talking about life, dreams, and their future together. "Maria, you're the only one for me." "Forever," Greg would say, looking at her with tenderness. "And you're mine," Maria would reply, feeling her heart race. They got married a year after they met. The wedding was grand and beautiful. All their friends and relatives were happy for them. Natalie was also present, wearing a tight dress and stunning high heels. But Maria was simply happy because she truly believed she had found true love and the man of her life. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me," Greg whispered, hugging his wife by the waist. Maria smiled, feeling her heart overflow with love. And yet, one thing slightly soured the atmosphere of the celebration, the prenuptial agreement, which the bride's father had insisted on drafting personally. James had arranged it in such a way that both spouses would feel protected. As a former lawyer and businessman, he insisted on a clause in the document stating that in the case of proven infidelity, the unfaithful spouse's partner would automatically receive 50% of the couple's joint assets in the event of a divorce, regardless of which spouse had committed the sin of infidelity. "My dear ones, I wish you happiness and many long years together. And also, I hope you'll never need the prenuptial agreement. Love each other, live in joy. Take care of your marriage, and be sure to celebrate your 50th wedding anniversary," James said into the microphone, raising his glass of champagne. "Bitter." Natalie shouted and tugged the string of the party popper above her friend's head, showering the newlyweds with colorful confetti. The first years of their married life were full of love and happiness. The couple traveled a lot, pursued their favorite activities, and made plans for the future. Maria continued writing. She even published a small book of poems. "You're incredibly talented," Greg admired, holding in his hands the first published book of his wife's. "I'm so proud of you." Thank you, darling. With a husband like you, it's really not that hard, Maria replied with a smile. But unfortunately, happiness was short-lived. 2 years after their wedding, Maria's parents died in a plane crash. The private jet they were flying in crashed over the Taiga Mountains, where the business couple was planning to open a mining plant for valuable minerals. By that time, James had already left the legal profession, and Sandra, like her husband, had left teaching to focus on their joint business. Maria was devastated, crushed by grief. Greg tried to support her, staying close by and comforting her as best as he could. "Maria, I will never leave you," he said, hugging his wife after the funeral ceremony at the cemetery. Maria looked at her husband with red, tear-filled eyes and barely whispered a single word. "Thank you." What else could she say? When, in one day, the cruel villain, fate, took away the closest people to you. At the same time, alongside the grief, a cold suspicion began to creep into her heart. Maria suddenly started noticing that, after the funeral, her husband seemed to distance himself from her. He had become more calculating, more detached. Natalie, too, had noticeably changed. The friend who had always been there during their university years had suddenly started pulling away. They used to chat for an hour or two on the phone, but now there was nothing to say to each other, except for a couple of meaningless, obligatory phrases. All of this floated back to Maria in the hospital room, like scenes from an old movie. Deep down, she knew she couldn't just dismiss these doubts. Something was clearly wrong. Why had Natalie suddenly agreed to come to their anniversary? Before that, her friend had tactfully refused to attend celebrations. First Maria's birthday, then Greg's personal celebration. Of course, Natalie hadn't begged to join the event. Maria had invited her herself. But still, her behavior now seemed strange. "Wanda, could you please tell me, has anyone come to see me?" Maria asked when she saw the nurse at the door with a tray of medication. "Yes, your husband came." Greg seemed very worried. And there was another woman, a brunette, very beautiful, in an expensive dress and heels, looking like she'd just come from a restaurant. I was surprised, though. Why dress up like that for a hospital visit? It's not a fashion show. "Natalie," Maria whispered. "Yes, I think that's what she was called," Wanda confirmed. "At least, that's what your husband called her. A sister, perhaps? Or a relative?" Maria lowered her eyes, embarrassed, sincerely hoping the nurse hadn't noticed the blush that had appeared on her cheeks. "No, a friend. We've been friends since university." Wanda smiled knowingly. "Ah, I see. Well, I'm glad you have such caring relatives and friends." Maria's heart clenched with pain. She knew she had to find out the truth, to understand what had happened yesterday and why Greg had called the ambulance so late. At the same time, she still pushed away the thought that her husband and friend might have been involved in something that would be too shameful to even think about, let alone say out loud. No, Greg wouldn't do that. And why would he put himself in such a position? Did he forget about our prenuptial agreement? "Thank you, Dad. He'll sort it out himself without even knowing," Maria sobbed. Only now did she realize how important the document her late father had drafted on her wedding day really was. And after all that, who could believe in premonitions? Maria had been absolutely certain, no, 200% sure, that Greg would be a faithful and reliable husband. Meanwhile, the autumn evening gradually enveloped the room in soft twilight. The window, covered with white curtains, hid the city lights outside. In the silence, the only sounds were the ticking of the clock and the faint beeping of the equipment connected to Maria. Suddenly, the door opened. Her doctor, Brett, appeared at the threshold. He held a folder with documents in his hands, and his face showed calm and confidence. "Maria," he began, stopping a couple of meters away, "I have good news for you. We've identified the drug found in your blood. It's quite rare, with limited distribution." Maria asked hopefully, "What is this drug? Who could have bought it?" Well, the name won't mean much to you. Brett waved his hand. It's mainly used to treat serious sleep disorders, but in small doses, it can be used as a sleeping pill. I contacted all the pharmacists in the city. They promised to provide data on people who have purchased it recently. So, you'll be able to find out who did this? Maria felt a spark of hope rising in her. And why are they obligated to report to you, if you don't mind me asking? The doctor hesitated. Well, let me put it in a way that's easier to understand. My former father-in-law is involved with the Ministry of Health in the region. We haven't kept in touch since my wife's passing. An inoperable brain tumor, Anastasia, was doomed. Of course, my father-in-law didn't blame me, although I haven't received any support from him for several years. But I can still use his name when dealing with work-related problems. Maria smiled. I see. Well, please, find out who tried to put me to sleep. We'll do our best, the doctor nodded. But for now, we need to be extremely cautious. And don't think of me as a paranoid, but I suggest installing a hidden camera in your room, just in case. Maria thought for a moment. Fear and anxiety battled within her, torn between the desire to uncover the truth. Of course, she had her doubts, but what if someone tried to harm her again? All right, she whispered with irony, go ahead and set up your camera. I just hope I get an award for Best Female Performance. Great, excellent. I appreciate your sense of humor, Brett smiled, and sensing her lingering doubts, added more seriously, I understand this is not an easy step, but sometimes such precautions are absolutely necessary. If you want to know, this camera once helped me in a difficult situation. Really? And what situation was that? Maria asked, feeling her curiosity overpower her caution. Brett sighed sadly. It was a tough case. I was living with Nancy at the time. She was complicated, with a tough character. From the very beginning of our relationship, she didn't get along with my son from my first marriage, Peter. He's 7 now. He's always been loud, energetic, and often annoyed his stepmother with his childhood mischief. Nancy constantly complained, tried to manipulate me, set her own terms. And like an idiot, I tried to find a compromise, but it was all in vain. The young doctor fell silent, as if recalling something unpleasant. Maria waited silently for him to continue. One day, Peter got sick, Brett continued. He had a fever, complained of a sore throat, and I was at work. Nancy was supposed to give him his medicine, but when I came home early, Peter was lying in bed, and she wasn't home. I immediately knew something was wrong. That's when I decided to install the hidden camera in the room. I wanted to know what was happening when I wasn't home. Maria nodded sympathetically. And what did you find out? She asked, barely audible. The footage showed that Nancy was hardly ever home, and my son was alone in a locked room, Brett continued. Later, I found out that she was quietly stealing money from my safe and buying expensive jewelry from the local jeweler. It was that footage that saved Peter. It helped me convince the court that Nancy was stealing from me. Thank God, everything turned out all right. The doctor looked at Maria, and his eyes expressed deep sadness. That's why I don't want anyone else to go through what my son and I went through. So, I ask you to trust me and allow me to set up the camera. Maria looked carefully at his face. In his eyes, she saw a sincere desire to help. And she really wanted to believe that this doctor truly wanted to protect her. Brett smiled slightly. I'll call the nurse now, and she'll help us set it up. Thank you, Brett, Maria whispered. No need to thank me. Just focus on getting better. And don't push yourself too hard during the holidays, all right? Brett advised, then added quietly, even if it's your wedding anniversary. Setting up the hidden camera took no more than 10 minutes. Brett was assisted by Wanda, who, as it turned out, was a distant relative of his on his father's side. According to Brett, he had full confidence in the medical staff in the department. He could vouch for each of them personally, but the people who would visit Maria sooner or later raised genuine suspicions and concerns in him. The night passed without incident. She didn't dream at all, but the significant improvement in her condition allowed her to sleep soundly. In the morning, the sun's rays, streaming through the curtains, illuminated the room, creating an illusion of calm and tranquility for the patient. Maria lay in bed, listening to the car speeding by outside, while her life seemed to have frozen in place. The poisoning from yesterday, the strange actions of Natalie and Greg at the celebration, these thoughts kept spinning in her mind, like a scratched record. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a door opening broke the peaceful morning silence. Brett entered the room. His usually friendly face was now serious and concerned. "Good morning, Maria. How are you feeling?" "Good morning, Brett. Much better. I still feel a bit weak, though." "Well, that's normal after such a medication-induced intoxication. But now your body is recovering." "Sorry it's taking so long. Unfortunately, I'm not a magician." The doctor sat down on the chair next to the bed. "By the way, I wanted to share some good news with you." Maria perked up. "Good news? Anything to cheer me up?" "Yes, there is. After reaching out to all the pharmacists yesterday, one of them finally remembered a woman who bought the drug that was found in your blood." "And who is she?" Maria asked, gripping the edge of the blanket in her hands. "Natalie Larson." Brett said the name as if it were synonymous with evil. "Natalie?" Maria whispered, unable to believe what she had just heard. "She's my friend. Why would she need sleeping pills? And prescribed ones, at that?" "Yes, it's her. The pharmacist mentioned that Natalie is seeing a psychologist for sleep disorders and apparently used this medication to combat insomnia," the doctor confirmed, watching Maria's reaction carefully. "But why did she do this?" Maria felt her voice trembling. The doctor sighed heavily. "Unfortunately, I can't answer that question yet. But perhaps this will help us get to the truth. My source also mentioned that Natalie is quite an eccentric person, known for her jealousy and manipulative tendencies. With permission from her treating doctor, I reviewed her medical history in detail. It turns out her sleep problem started after a failed attempt to get pregnant. She was devastated by the idea that she could no longer have children. That's when she lost her peace of mind." Maria paused, recalling her friend's smile, the persistence with which she interacted with Greg, and the strange, almost predatory gleam in her eyes. "But that's no reason. Why am I to blame?" Maria couldn't finish the sentence, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "What did I do to her? I always helped her when needed, loaning her money, and not just loans, sometimes giving it to her secretly from Greg. We were friends, and Natalie always lived more poorly than I did. Well, there's nothing to be done about it now. What Natalie did is a crime. And we need to find an explanation for it." Brett squeezed Maria's hand, trying to comfort her. "Maria, I understand this is really hard for you right now, but you have to stay strong. We will do everything we can to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. For now, try to rest. You need peace. We'll keep you informed of any developments." "How could this happen? Was I really so blind?" The doctor shrugged and left the room. The rounds were approaching, and he couldn't spend all his time with just one patient, even one he personally felt sympathy for. Maria, still feeling weak and with a slight headache, lay on the pristine white bed, watching the play of light and shadow on the walls. The events of yesterday, like a nightmare, continued to torment her. The poisoning, the sleeping pills, the rare drug, and her friend's name suddenly appearing out of nowhere kept her restless. Closer to noon, the silence in the room was broken by a timid knock. Then Wanda's voice was heard. "Maria, you have visitors." Greg and Natalie entered the room. Greg was holding a small bouquet of flowers, and Natalie was clutching some sort of basket. Their smile seemed forced and unnatural. However, her husband, dressed in a sharp suit, looked as impeccable as ever. Natalie, in a bright dress and her trademark heels, looked like a character from a cheap romance novel. Maria, involuntarily tensing up, watched the visitors with surprise. "Maria, darling, how are you feeling?" Greg approached the bed, but his voice only caused disgust. Fine, she replied shortly, trying not to look at her friend, whose eyes were gleaming with a mysterious sparkle. Well, that's good. Greg sat down in the chair, placing the unremarkable bouquet of flowers, which seemed to have just been picked from a city flower bed, next to him. We decided to visit you, to see how you're doing. Thank you, Maria said with effort, fully aware that this visit was more than just a polite gesture. And we brought you some fruit, Natalie added, handing her a basket with ripe peaches and grapes. I hope you'll like it. Maria, feeling a tremor starting to take over her, tactfully declined. Something about all of this stirred an uncontrollable sense of unease inside her. You seem a bit tense today, Greg remarked with a feigned concern. No, everything's fine, Maria tried to smile, but it didn't come out well. I just haven't fully recovered yet. Oh, darling, you really scared us. Natalie pretended to sigh dramatically, showing just how much she had been worried. When we found out you were poisoned, we were horrified. At that moment, Maria felt her heart tighten with anxiety. She suddenly realized that none of this was accidental. Her husband and Natalie knew exactly what had happened. I wonder who could have done this. Natalie continued in the same tone. Did you upset anyone? Maybe someone envied your happiness with Greg? I don't know, Maria replied evasively, feeling her cheeks redden. Could these lovers really think she would believe this act? Well, that's not really important, Greg suddenly said sharply, pulling a stack of photographs from the inside pocket of his jacket. What matters is that not only have you recovered, but you've also given us something interesting. Maria stared in horror at the pictures. They showed her sleeping on the bed next to an unfamiliar man. Maria was fully clothed, covered up to her neck with a blanket, while he was comfortably lying beside her in a t-shirt and underwear. What is this? Maria asked softly. These are the proofs of your infidelity, Greg replied coldly. And now, darling, you'll have to give me half of everything you own. Isn't that what your late father wanted? What? Greg, what are you talking about? This is a lie. Her husband shook his head, smirking. A lie? Sure, if you say so. Do you really think I would invent such a dirty story for no reason? You staged all this? Maria felt tears welling in her eyes. You drugged me with sleeping pills and arranged this with that actor too. Correct. I'll give you an A for your ingenuity, Greg said with a cold smile. Yes, I made sure the story had a conclusion. And Natalie, what's her role in all this? Maria whispered with difficulty. Natalie? She's my beloved woman, Greg answered calmly. We love each other. We've been together for years now. How could you? Maria, overwhelmed by a wave of pain, still couldn't believe the cynicism in her husband's words. Why not? Greg sneered. You were too busy with your career, your poetry, your journalism, and I wanted love and attention. Maria froze, unable to find words. She suddenly remembered that kiss from her friend at the anniversary, as if it were a fleeting impulse. So this was what had been hidden behind Natalie's behavior. Now that you've lost everything, you understand, Natalie took a step forward, showing who was in charge, that happiness isn't in work, it's in love, and also in children, the ones you couldn't give Greg, but I could. Too bad I couldn't carry the baby to term, and all because of you, darling, because of you. You didn't give your husband freedom, you literally smothered him with your sweet care. But he's a man, a hunter by nature, he needs thrills. And you think this is normal? Everything you're telling me? Maria could hardly hold back her tears. It's vile, Natalie. And vile. Greg smirked. In love, like in war, all means are fair. Surely you've read that in your books. Or your lawyer father never clued you in? What a great strategist. He wrote up a prenuptial agreement. Get out, both of you. Maria turned her back, unwilling to see their mocking smiles. Oh, we're leaving. Greg stood up and took Natalie's hand. But you think about how we're going to divorce quietly and split the property without any publicity. A minute later, her husband and her friend headed for the door, leaving behind the scent of cheap perfume and the bitter taste of betrayal. Alone, Maria burst into bitter tears. The tears flooded her eyes, blurring everything around her. She realized her world had collapsed in an instant. Friends, work, family, everything she had believed in turned to ash. And in that ash, she saw nothing but deceit and treachery. At that moment, Brett entered the room. He immediately noticed the tears on her face. What happened? Are you feeling worse? They were here, the traitors. Maria gasped for breath, unable to say a word. Who? Brett gently stroked her hand. Please, tell me. Maria, struggling to hold back her sobs, told him everything, the photos, the betrayal of her husband and her friend. He listened carefully. His face was serious and focused. Don't worry, the doctor said after Maria finished her story, we'll sort everything out. But how? She was desperate. They've already prepared all the evidence. My husband has all the cards in his hands. My father personally drafted that prenuptial agreement. Well, don't be so categorical. We can expose their forgery, Brett said confidently. He nodded toward the lens of the hidden camera. I already have the footage on my phone. We just need to get a lawyer who will defend you. Thank you, Maria looked at him with gratitude. I feel so awkward. I'll be right here, Brett smiled. Don't worry, they won't succeed. A week passed quickly while Maria awaited her discharge, but for her, it felt like an eternity filled with fear, anger, and confusion. Brett, like a guardian angel, was always by her side, supporting, calming, and explaining what steps to take next. Maria, you need to move, he said, gathering her things from the hospital room. You'll be in danger at home. Your husband won't rest until he gets what he wants. But where? A hotel? Maria whispered. You can come to my place, Brett smiled awkwardly. I have a spare room, and I think Peter will be happy to have you. Maria hesitated. Moving in with a man she had known for only a few days seemed like an imprudent decision. But, on the other hand, alongside her uncertainty, other feelings had settled in her heart, trust and gratitude toward the doctor. Thank you, Brett, she whispered. I think I'll agree. The apartment turned out to be cozy and bright. It had an atmosphere of calm and warmth. When Peter saw the guest, he excitedly ran up to her, reaching out his little hands. Look, I can build towers, he exclaimed, proudly showing her a structure made of blocks. Maria sat on the floor, and the little boy immediately clung to her as if he had found a long-lost kindred spirit. She, exhausted and confused, unexpectedly felt needed and very important. What a wonderful castle you built. She smiled, hugging the boy. You're beautiful. Like Cinderella or Snow White, Peter shouted joyfully, stroking her hair with his tiny hand. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes. In that moment, she realized that despite all the hardships, there could still be light in her life, a place for warmth and love. Thank you, she whispered, wiping the tears from her cheeks. Brett, watching them from the living room, gave a subtle smile. He could see how Maria was slowly recovering from the shock, and the spark of hope was lighting up again in her eyes. Maria, I've arranged a legal consultation for you, he said, as Peter became absorbed in playing with his toy cars. We need to prepare for the trial. Greg clearly isn't joking. But what can I do? Maria felt helpless, like a toy in the hands of fate. This photo. We'll prove it's a forgery, Brett reassured her. We have some aces up our sleeve. First and foremost, the footage from the camera and the testimony from the pharmacist at the pharmacy that Natalie was the one who bought those drugs. In the following days, life was consumed by the hustle and bustle of preparing for the trial. Maria studied documents, consulted with lawyers, and tried to understand how the events of that terrible night had unfolded. At times, panic would overwhelm her, but Brett and Peter were there to support her. The young doctor, for his part, continued his own investigation. Brett kept taking care of Maria like a true knight. He made her breakfast, read books to her before bed, and was always by her side, ready to support her in the right moment. "You're a beautiful woman," he said one evening, "strong, smart, and infinitely kind, and you definitely deserve happiness." Maria smiled, looking at him with new eyes, feeling for the first time in a long while that she was truly happy. The trial was set for the following week. Despite her fear, she was ready to fight for her honor. She knew now that she had Brett and Peter by her side, and that gave her strength. The day before the trial, Brett gently took her hand. "I'm always here. We'll get through this." Maria, squeezing his hand in return, felt warmth spreading through her body. "Thank you. I'm really ready to stand up to my husband and my friend. Well, my former friend." The next day, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The heavy, stuffy air hung in the space, pressing down on their shoulders. In the center was the judge's table, behind which sat a woman in a strict black robe. Her face, hidden behind thick glasses with golden frames, seemed impenetrable. "The case of Maria and Greg Howard regarding the divorce is now in session," the judge said in a steady, emotionless voice. "We will now proceed with the consideration of the claim." Greg, pale and uncertain, sat next to his lover. She, as always, was glowing, dressed in a new dress and high heels. "Your Honor," began Greg's lawyer, "in defending my client's interests, I believe this marriage should be dissolved. However, given the current situation, we insist on an equal division of property. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, Maria violated the prenuptial agreement by committing adultery." With these words, the lawyer, with an air of importance, handed over photographs showing Maria sleeping in bed with a stranger. "These photographs are irrefutable proof of her infidelity," he continued. Maria felt a lump rising in her throat. "Your Honor," Brett interjected, and his confident, calm voice immediately captured the room's attention. "The presented evidence is fabricated." "How dare you?" Natalie shouted, jumping up from her seat. "He's lying." The judge tapped her gavel warningly. "We have proof," Brett continued, addressing the judge, "that Maria was drugged with a rare sleeping pill, which her friend Natalie Larson bought at the pharmacy the day before. It was while Maria was asleep that she was photographed with an actor her husband had hired in advance." "That's a lie," Greg shouted. "This is absurd, I swear." "And finally," Brett announced, "we have provided the court with footage from a hidden camera in Maria's hospital room. In it, her husband and friend openly admit to their actions." Silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone stared at Greg and Natalie in disbelief. "Greg Howard," the judge addressed the unlucky husband, "in light of the presented evidence, we find you guilty of attempted poisoning and forgery. You are required to compensate your now ex-wife for emotional damages. Furthermore, Natalie Larson is also being held accountable for assisting in the commission of the crime." Greg, losing all hope, lowered his head. Natalie, pale and stunned, could not utter a word. As for the divorce, the judge continued, "The marriage between Maria and Greg Howard is hereby dissolved. By court decision, all property remains with its rightful owner." Whispers and murmurs of outrage filled the room. Greg was crushed. He had lost everything: his wife, his property, his reputation. Maria, feeling a wave of relief wash over her, smiled at Brett. Her eyes sparkled with happiness. "We did it," he whispered. After the trial, Maria felt like a completely different person. She no longer had to fear Greg and Natalie. She could start a new life. At home, once the excitement had settled, Peter ran up to them and, smiling, asked, "Mom, Dad, are you going to get married soon?" Maria and Brett exchanged an embarrassed glance. In their eyes reflected love and happiness. "Yes, Peter," Maria replied. "Very soon." "Right, Brett?" Brett nodded, then, laughing, swept her up like a bride and twirled her around the room. And at that moment, A new chapter began in their lives, one filled with love, mutual respect, and hope. They had defeated the bad people and found their true happiness.